Hello students, and welcome back to this tutorial of Blender Basics in hopefully less than 10 minutes. We're going to pick up roughly where we left off with our primitive scene in place, and we've still got shadows casting here, so that looks kind of cool. One thing you'll notice that's a little different from last time is when I go into my rendered view, it takes a little longer here, and it's actually a little different looking. The shadows are more precise, a little less blocky, and that's because I'm using a different rendering engine. So by default, Blender has you use the rendering engine, and they're over here under this little camera tab, has you use the rendering engine called Eevee. And you can see that the shadows are blocky there, but it's very responsive, very quick. It's really good for previews, but it's not as accurate as the Cycles render engine, which is the one that I was using right here. Cycles is what's called an unbiased render engine. You can see that it takes a little bit longer for the view to catch up when I manipulate my view when I'm tumbling around. And this is with a very fast video card, GPU accelerated graphics processing unit, you can see over here. So Cycles takes more calculation, but it gives you a more accurate result, and that's kind of an important thing to know. I pretty much always use Cycles because of this, but there are instances where you can get pretty much equivalent results with Eevee. So that's just kind of going forward. We're going to be using Cycles in these tutorials, but you should be aware that Eevee is the default option, and it can be a good option at times. So we're going to start making this scene a little less boring. Let's select our cube here, and let's dive right into color. So I'm going to go over here to all these different tabs that I have, and this little sphere with the checkerboard pattern on it, that's my Materials tab. And since this cube is the default object that was added first here in Blender, it already has a material assigned. You'll notice the sphere does not, and the cone and the plane also do not. That's because I added them after the fact, and they're not the initial default cube. The default cube that every Blender instance starts with already has a material assigned, and it's just called material. So let's give that a more descriptive name so that we can kind of keep track of things. Let's call this cube underscore green. And that's not a very good name for it at the moment because it's white. So we're going to change the base color, and we're in a rendered view, so this should show up right away as I change my cube to green. And you'll notice something. There's a little bit of green light reflecting onto my sphere now and onto my cone, and that's because that's an accurate feature of the Cycles render engine. The light bounces that naturally happen when you stick colored objects next to each other, colored light bounces off of them. That's why things appear green, so that's kind of cool. Now I'm going to get maybe a little more complicated with this. I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm in face select mode, you can see up here, and I'm going to select just one of the faces of my cube. And up here I've got all this space basically for what are called material slots, and there's only one material slot right now. It's filled with my cube green material, but I can add a new slot. I can add more than one material to an object. So down here I've just got a few tools basically, because this is an empty slot. I'm going to create a new material, and we'll call this cube underscore red, and we'll change the base color to a nice bright fire engine red, and that does nothing to the cube. That's because the first material here, the first material slot, is the master one, and it takes precedence. So what I need to do, that's why I'm in edit mode, because I can select components of my object in edit mode. And with this face selected, I'm going to choose my cube red material and click on assign. and then I tab out of edit mode, and you can see that that gives me one fire engine red face on my cube. So that's kind of cool. So let's make this cube into a little bit more of an interesting shape. Let's play with some editing tools here. I am going to select my cube, and I can isolate it for editing in a couple of different ways. I can either select the other objects and tap H, and that will hide them. You can see that my cone listed in the outliner now has its little eye poked out. I can do the same thing to my sphere. I can hide the sphere, or I can reveal the sphere again. Or if I press Alt-H on the keyboard, then it unhides everything that's hidden. Or I can go into what's called local mode with the cube. So if I select just the cube and I tap the / on the number pad, then that puts me in a local mode. And you can see that my light is now hidden. My plane, which I'm using for a floor, I can only see the cube. And this is still a rendered view, but there's not much to show me that it's a rendered view because there's not actually a light source really, other than just kind of the gray surroundings sort of gives a little bit of light. So I'm going to go back to my material preview viewport mode so that I can play with this in a little bit better view so it's not so dark. And I'm going to tab back into edit mode and use just a couple of tools. So if I want, I can select this top face and I can scale it to make it so that my cube is no longer cubic. And I think that might be a good place to start, kind of give it sort of some bottom heavy weight, I guess. And let's play with this red face a little bit. So the other thing I can do is I can inset. So I'm going to tap I to inset that, and you can see that what an inset does is it basically creates 5 faces where there were previously just one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1 in the middle. And that inset sets me up for another operation which is called extrude. So I'm going to tap E to extrude, and then that gives me the ability to take that face and make 5 more faces, but I'm also moving them perpendicular to that original face. That's the difference between an inset and an extrude operation, is that perpendicular movement. So I can kind of do the same thing on top here. Let's inset I and then click and then extrude E. And I can really quickly make a much more complicated object this way than I would have been able to. And you can see that because I started on my red face, all of these new faces that were created through inset and extrusion operations inherited the same material. The same thing would happen if I start on a green face. I can inset here and then extrude, inset, and then extrude. Sorry, a little typo there. And that's not perfectly symmetrical, but that's okay. We'll show how to make things symmetrical in another tutorial. So I'm going to tab back out of edit mode and say that I'm satisfied with the complexity of this object. If I want to leave my local mode, then I just tap that / key again, and then I can go back to a rendered view and kind of see how things are looking here. And I can see that I've got objects clipping together now. So let's move this cone in the x-axis, GX. And I also want that cone to be casting more of a shadow. The light is almost directly overhead it now. So let's move that down in the z-axis. Okay, that's good. So the next thing we're going to do is actually we're going to keep playing with our light because this light sort of, it's kind of nice and dramatic, but it's not terribly exciting. So I'm going to add a new light, and I can use my usual add menus, Shift A, and I can come down here to lights, and you can see I've got 3 kinds of lights. I have a point light, which is the light that I currently have in the scene is a point light. And the attributes of a point light are that it shines in all directions spherically, 360 degrees in every axis. So it's kind of a good light to emulate like the effect of a light bulb or something like that. I can also add a spotlight, which is very directional and sort of has this cone of influence that I can play with, or an area light, which is flat and directional. So you might compare that one to like a window in a room, or like one of those fluorescent panels on the ceiling of a room. And finally, you've got a sun lamp. And a sun lamp is a little different than the other three because these three all have fall off. You can see that here these shadows are getting fuzzier as they get farther away from their initial object, and they also kind of fade in their influence. The light's brightest over here nearest the light, and the light's not as bright over here because the light is falling off. It's fading away as its influence diminishes with distance. A sun lamp doesn't do that. Sunlight is directional and it doesn't diminish, so it's kind of like it kind of mimics the effect of the sun on our planet Earth. So I'm going to add an area light because those are really cool because they have some size to them. And over here I now have a new tab. I have this light tab, and I've got attributes for this area light. So I'm going to turn the wattage way up, and you can see the effect that's having. And I'm also going to play with the color. I'm going to make this area light kind of bluish, and I'm going to increase the size. And what increasing the size does is it changes the size of my shadows. So from here now I can rotate in X, and I can kind of move this thing around, and I kind of have a little more exciting play on the light here. That's kind of cool because I've got some blue creeping into my shadows, and that's pretty cool. So the last thing I think I'm going to do here before we render is I'm going to go over to my World tab, and I'm going to change the color of my world. So right now it's just kind of this neutral gray, and that's not very exciting, so I'm going to kind of brighten it up and give it a little bit of a bluish, kind of a sky blue hue. And you have to be careful with the blue of a sky because it's not actually generally this sort of royal blue that we sometimes want to color it. It's usually a pretty light, kind of airy blue. So that'll make this feel a little more like it's kind of could be outside or could be getting some outside light. And you can see that the color of my shadows and reflections are now reflecting that blue in the scene. If I wanted this to just totally, rely on my added lights only, the lights that are in my outliner, I'd take this world color down to 100% black. But whoops, when I did that it took away my blue hue. There we go. Alright, so to wrap things up, last of all I'm going to show you how to render an image. And all we have to do, we're in cycles, so we can go and check our render settings here. Our output, this little printer icon here, tells us what resolution we're going to render at, and it also gives us the opportunity to choose a folder and a format for our output file. You don't have to do that because if we just go to our render menu here and click render image, it's going to render that for us, and once it finishes I can just go to the image menu and click save as, and that will allow me to also save in a different format. I can save as a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF, and it will allow me to save into different folders and locations if I want. So I hope that's helpful. I realize we've taken almost 15 minutes here instead of the usual 10. But I think we got through some important stuff, so I hope you have a great day.